US President Donald Trump's call for regime change in Iran reflects a long-standing US strategy that evolved from overt coups to covert tactics, like sanctions and proxy wars. Under the guise of democracy, the US has repeatedly toppled elected governments, installed compliant regimes, and left lasting instability worldwide. Here's a look at some nations Washington liberated. White farmers backed by the US overthrew Hawaii's monarchy, which ultimately led to the region being annexed in 1898 and becoming a US state in 1959. The US invaded nations across the Caribbean and occupied Cuba. After repeated failed attempts to unseat Havana's leadership, Washington imposed decades of sanctions, leaving Cuba politically isolated and economically crippled. The CIA, in collaboration with British intelligence, overthrew Iran's then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the oil industry. The coup aimed to control Tehran's resources by restoring the Shah's authoritarian rule, which sparked the 1979 revolution and shaped current US-Iran tensions. Guatemala's President Jacobo Arbenz introduced land reforms that threatened US agribusiness. As a result, the CIA launched a covert operation that toppled his leadership, triggering decades of military dictatorship and civil war. The US planned to remove the Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, labeling him an undesirable nationalist. His assassination plunged the Congo into decades of chaos as a result of US plundering of the country's vast mineral reserves. Washington used economic warfare and covert support designed to, quote, make the economy scream in order to destabilize Chile's socialist president. It led to a military coup that installed General Augusto Pinochet, whose dictatorship brought 17 years of brutal repression and human rights abuses. The US secretly funded Contra forces to overthrow Nicaragua's socialist Sandinista government, even illegally selling arms to Iran to do so. The Sandinistas lost power in 1990 after a US-backed opposition victory. The US invasion of Iraq, justified through false claims of Baghdad possessing weapons of mass destruction, aimed to secure regional dominance and access to oil. The aftermath unleashed sectarian violence and paved the way for the rise of terror group Daesh. The US helped oust Haiti's President Jean-Bertrand Aristide twice, labeling him a threat to stability. Washington believed his government opposed American interests and supported his forcible removal. Washington recognized an opposition leader as the interim president of Venezuela in an attempt to accelerate the removal of Nicolas Maduro from power, a move driven by the country's significant oil reserves. While Maduro remains in control, sanctions and diplomatic isolation have left Venezuela mired in a political and economic crisis. Then came Bolivia, where disputed and later debunked fraud claims promoted by US-backed observers triggered unrest that led to a military-backed ousting of newly re-elected President Evo Morales and the installation of an unelected government. US strikes targeted Iranian nuclear sites, officially to curb nuclear development, with no overt statements about seeking to provoke regime change. Yet, President Trump openly posed a telling rhetorical question. Why wouldn't there be regime change? As tensions rise over Iran's nuclear capabilities, the well-established history of US efforts to subvert foreign governments is resurfacing in public discourse, with the goal of these interventions being to sow chaos, leaving behind collapsed institutions, mass displacement, and prolonged violence.